This party has got to look and feel and talk and sound like a completely different organisation.
I've always thought he was the sanest person to lead the Conservative Party in my lifetime, including me.
He was a very supple, quicksilver politician, but he constantly prioritised short-term tactics over long-term strategy.
David Cameron was an almost uniquely capable leader that came to power a little early, and before he developed the wisdom and experience to be a great statesman.
Jobs lost, pay cut, benefits squeezed.
I think people will look back on the period of government that David Cameron led and I was involved in as a period of enlightened, progressive, rational government. And I think they will spend many years wondering when we're going to see that government again.
He said the will of the British people must be respected, but the country should have a new Prime Minister.
How comes he can scuttle off? He called all this on. So what's happened to that twat David Cameron?
Oh, no regrets.
Where is he? He's in Europe, in Nice, with his trotters up, yeah? Where is the geezer?
Everybody happy?
Yes, thank you.
Are we running?
Yep.
Right. Speed? Good. Our BBC Referendum Centre in London, where results from 382...
My way along Downing Street through the night.
You'll see the scoreboard that tells us Britain's future.
Obviously, when people look back at my time as Prime Minister for 6 years and leader of the Conservative Party for 11 years, this final event, I know, will obviously loom larger than anything else, and I understand that.
Britain has voted to leave the EU.
As the British establishment reels from its biggest slapdown in modern history.
Let's have some news.
Look at the amount of dark...
Leave campaigners are jubilant at the result.
I knew this was a huge decision for the country. But I hope that people will also look back and see someone who came along and said he wanted to change the Conservative Party, he wanted to modernise it, he wanted to get it back in the centre ground, he wanted it to serve the country again, and we did change those things. There has hardly been a day that's gone by since then when I haven't sort of reflected and thought about how much I missed the job that I was doing and enjoying and cared about so deeply.
So the Prime Minister, leaving Buckingham Palace.
He's just driving to Downing Street now. The gates of Downing Street are open and the traffic is about to be shut.
No other Labour leader has ever done this. Tony Blair's third election win in a row meant he could go to Buckingham Palace with his wife and ask the Queen permission to form his third government. He could reflect that before today, only Margaret Thatcher had made history in this way.
It was a pretty desperate state of affairs for the Conservatives. Tony Blair was carrying everything in front of him, even with the Iraq War and all the problems that Tony Blair was having. You know, we really didn't advance very far. I believed the party needed to change, the party needed to modernise. My frustration was we couldn't do any of these things because the Conservative Party was out of touch, out of date, seemed to be permanently out of office, and it had to change. And the more I sat on those green benches, the more I thought this has to change, and the more I began to think, well, maybe I could do this. I've sort of formed quite an alliance with George Osborne, who'd become my partner, and we just decided we were going to do everything we could to try and, you know, modernise the Conservative Party.
We were children of the Blair years in the sense that we were Conservatives who had to respond to the change in politics and the fact that the Conservative Party had kept losing to this pretty effective political partnership of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. It doesn't mean we agreed with their political partnership and what they had done, but it did mean we had to respond to the changes they'd brought to the country.
This party has got to look and feel and talk and sound like a completely different organisation.
I mean, David described himself famously as the heir to Blair at one lunch, and they had to sort of reel back on that a bit. So there's clearly a great deal of admiration by Cameron and Osborne for Blair and what Blair had achieved.
Pay no tax, pay no rates, and bring wealth to those areas.
He's just 38. He was educated at Eton and was only elected to Parliament in 2001. He dismissed accusations that he's too posh and inexperienced to lead the party.
5 years, maybe I don't have the experience to do the job.
We were chopping and changing leaders like we change our socks. And we didn't have an ongoing theme as to what we were about. Cameron, for heaven's sake, you know, he'd only been there 5 minutes and suddenly he was standing for leader of the party.
People depicted David and his friends and supporters as the Notting Hill set. They meant to be disparaging. They said, who are these young whippersnappers? Probably from privileged backgrounds who are telling us what the Conservative Party should be. They might represent the views of the metropolitan chattering classes, the Waitrose shoppers of this world, but they don't understand this country. The truth, however, was that those of us who were involved in seeking to change the Conservative Party at that time were anxious to say that the Conservative Party needed to be a truly national organisation.
Kensington, isn't it?
I was brought up in Scunthorpe, so it's not too different from here.
The favourite, David Davis, brought up on a council estate by a single mother, Mr Double D says his roots carry a political message for potential Tory voters.
I think he felt his great backstory and one lick of paint would be enough to get the Tory car out of the ditch, and I just didn't think that was true. I thought we needed a far more profound change. I didn't think he would deliver it.
David's always been good at, I mean, he used to sometimes fulminate that people thought of him as a PR man, but he was good at that side of things. He was, as it were, a young, fresh face. And if you are starting with an approach for which change is the underpinning or the foundation of the strategy, having a new face is a good thing.
Real change isn't just about policies or presentation or organisation or even, dare I say it, having a young, vigorous, energetic leader. Although, come to think of it, it's not such a bad idea. It was the manner of the delivery, the confidence of the delivery. There were promises made and things said, but in the end it was about an effect, a penumbra effect of this is someone who looks different, sounds different, who can give us a chance. Passion in our bodies, nothing and no one will stop us. Thank you. The party conference went better than we could ever have expected, and the rest of the campaign was about holding on to a lead, and from that moment, the leadership election took on a totally different hue.
Have you ever taken hard drugs? Might seem an odd question, but it was a question designed, I am sure, to damage the new front-runner in this race, David Cameron. He was asked in one interview tonight, was he saying he'd not snorted cocaine since he'd been an MP?
Yeah, I've absolutely answered your question.
So say no?
I've just said no. People have a private past. What you do in that past is your business. What you do in public life is different. And that's the line I drew, and I very stubbornly stuck to it. I mean, the truth is that when I was at Eton, I did, when I was about 16, slightly lose my way, got in with some people who were bringing some cannabis into the school, and we were smoking it, and we were all caught, and this was a moment of sort of, you know, shock and horror from my parents and everybody else, and I was very fortunate not to be thrown out. I think it made me think, come on, put yourself together, and that's pretty much what I did.
They voted for David Davis, 64,398. They voted for David Cameron, 134,446.
The result had not been in doubt, the margin had been. Over two-thirds of Tory members had rejected experience and chosen instead someone not even in the Commons 5 years ago.
The problems the Conservative Party faced were so profound in the way that we were perceived and the way we hadn't been addressing all the issues that a modern party should be addressing, we had to take some risks. It wasn't enough to sort of move the dial a little bit. We had to give it a great big shove.
He's got the environment in his sights, and he wants to shoot down suggestions that only the other parties care about climate change.
And that means a dog sled ride to a melting glacier.
David Cameron has arrived in Rwanda for a 2-day visit to set out his party's approach to tackling global poverty.
For too long in our party, instead of talking about the things that most people care about, we talked about what we cared about most. We were sometimes banging on about Europe.
I think that whenever you come into an organisation and you try and reposition it, or rebrand it, the people who've been there working hard in it for many years, whether as MPs or as professionals in the party, are going to feel alienated by that. They're going to feel a sense of rejection that something that they've been doing wasn't of equal value. And there was inevitably some friction.
Vote blue, go green is not some namby-pamby message for Notting Hill. It's something that I think chimes in every part of our country.
The vote blue, get green mantra, which he started for the driving huskies and things, and saying that we were all for green solutions, and he put a wind turbine on top of his house, and the council made him take it down. In the end, these things were not serious reappraisals of the issues facing the country.
If you'd been out of the country, you'd be forgiven for getting very confused about exactly which political party David Cameron is heading up.
There are some old Conservatives out there who wouldn't like to be told what to do and how to do it.
A lot of our membership thought that the 1950s had been a much better time to be a Conservative or to be in the United Kingdom at all. Cameron's attitude was, no, these are our best days. You know, modern Britain is a pleasant place, a place we should seek to represent.
Just like Tony Blair before him, David Cameron says he may be ditching policies, but he's not changing his party's values.
It was obvious that the Conservative Party did need to refresh its image and its approach and its communications. It was less obvious that it needed to tear up a policy platform.
A modern, compassionate conservatism is right for our times, right for this new generation, right for our party and right for our country. The best is yet to come.
I think that whilst some quarters of the party will have been a little bit slower to these ideas, you couldn't face electoral defeat in the way that we were and being marginalised in the way that we were. So I think whilst they didn't always deep down agree with what we were saying, I think they grudgingly accepted that that was the direction of travel and they had to get on the train.
In history, Conservatives have been great social reformers, and I think we became too much of the economics party. It was just all about the economy and tax cuts and all things I approved of, but we'd totally forgotten and stopped talking about how you build a stronger and better society.
There have been more big falls in the value of shares as the collapse of Lehman Brothers Bank reverberates around the
Shares
world.
in banks took a battering. HBOS, which at one point was down 40%.
For the UK's proud and illustrious banking industry, 13/10/2008 has been a day of dismal shame. Today's bill for taxpayers to bail out the banks was £37 billion.
We thought, this is going to change everything. This is going to completely change the politics of this country and indeed the politics of the world. And we have to completely rethink what we're saying to the British people and the offer we're making.
From today, to the delight of Tory activists, David Cameron ripped up his spending promises.
There have been many activists that have never been quite sure about David Cameron, and I think activists will love this announcement. This is where they think the Conservative Party should be, as sort of the Thatcherite housewife economics policies.
I knew we were going to have to make difficult decisions. If we get in, we are going to have to make cuts. And better to say that in advance of the election and have that credibility, even though it might cost you some support. I mean, I remember saying at a press conference, I'd rather, you know, be a good Prime Minister for one term than a bad one for two.
The Conservatives are going to cut spending on housing, on education, on policing, on all the vital public services. He cannot evade the fact that his figures are lower than any of ours in any year, and that is the truth about public spending in our country.
I think David wanted to be a good time Prime Minister in many ways, and he was setting out a vision for Britain which was more generous, which was more inclusive, where he was talking about reform of the public services. I think the Prime Minister he had to be was very different after the financial crisis.
So what veg we got with it? So then you've got some lamb.
At that time, I thought, can I take the pressure? Can my family take the pressure? Will I be able to cope with all the extra pressure that we were under because of looking after Ivan? That's the thing about people with disabled children. You're not volunteers, and you're not angels. You know, you often fall down and fail in the care and love for your child because it's incredibly exhausting. What are you saying? Ivan would suddenly have dozens of seizures sometimes in a row and, you know, uncontrollable, and you'd have to just get to the hospital and get him, you know, get the right medicines and the right treatments. And I think it strengthened us as a couple and as a family, actually, that we just said to each other, we're going to get through this, we're going to manage this, it's going to be okay. And we never really sort of talked about it again like that. We just got on with it.
Every child is precious and irreplaceable, and the death of a child is an unbearable sorrow that no parent should ever have to endure.
One night he just was particularly bad, and it felt that night there was something that had really gone wrong with him. And so we all got up in the middle of the night, and Samantha went off to the hospital. Initially I stayed behind with the other children, but I knew something wasn't right. So I took the risk of leaving the children and just rushed off to the hospital. And you know, he'd had very bad seizures, and he'd had his sort of, everything had gone into sort of collapse. And the staff were trying to do everything they could to resuscitate him, but they couldn't.
There were moments, I think, where David thought maybe he couldn't carry on. And I remember thinking, in that job, you have so little time to recover, you have so little time to mourn. And I suspect that he would have benefited, him and Samantha, having a bit more time to grieve. I think that pretty much, you know, a few months after that, he was in the run-up to the 2010 election. And I imagine the strain of that would have been immense.
Right. You can see now just 29 days to go until polling day. Brown is on his way to the palace. The moment we've all been waiting for is here. We've said we're going to cut $6 billion in the first year.
You're not saying how.
You know, we felt we were on a roll, but the big question for me was always, can you do this in one go? Can you overturn this very big majority? And can you get a swing that's big enough? And I think in my heart of hearts, I always doubted we'd be able to get there in one go.
Manchester, in the heart of the northwest of England, is tonight host to a British political first. I'm Alastair Stewart, and for the first time on British television, live in front of a representative studio audience, we'll be hearing from three men, each hoping to be the leader of the next UK government in the first election debate.
When we were preparing for them, I could see what was going to come, which was, you know, I was going to be arguing with Gordon Brown about this, that and the other, and the guy in the middle, Nick Clegg, was going to have an absolutely fantastic time of it.
So he's going to be taking money out of every single school in the country. Gordon Brown.
Be honest about the risk.
Why are you doing a jobs tax?
You're going to take $1 billion at least out of the schools this year.
This is just a complete invention of a figure plucked out of the air. Mr. Clegg.
I'm not sure if you're like me, but the more they attack each other, the more they sound exactly the same.
Gentlemen,
I was the leader of a party that had never been in government before. At that time, there was just a sort of effortless assumption in the Westminster Village and the media and so on that this was a two-party gunfight between Gordon Brown and David Cameron. I just don't think anyone expected, including, I have to say, myself, that I would be able to intrude into it. We all know we've got this great black hole in our public finances. We all know that we're going to have to make cuts. There are going to be big things over the next few years, and neither of them will come clean on this with you.
I knew I'd messed up, and I knew this had big consequences because I was desperately worried about my friends and colleagues who were possibly going to lose seats because of what I'd got wrong. There was this period in the election campaign where Clegg mania took off.
David said to me, look, I think we're not going to get there. We might have to form some kind of alliance with the Liberal Democrats, and I think we should go for a full coalition. And why don't we examine whether that's possible? And so a couple of days later, the team sat down and we did something that no one had ever done before, which was read the Liberal Democrat manifesto.
Well, the polls closed half an hour ago, and we now have our first indication of what the result of the election might be.
And this is what we're saying. It's going to be a hung parliament with the Conservatives as the largest party.
After the sort of party at Central Office, I went back to the Plaza Hotel in Westminster, just over the bridge from the House of Commons. I remember just trying to get sort of an hour's sleep. But I woke up with a sort of real clear feeling about what had to happen next. The crisis in the country was deep. We had huge economic problems. We were a nation at war with troops in Afghanistan, and I knew the responsible thing to do, the right thing to do, was to say, let's try and do something much bigger and bolder. I sort of jumped out of bed and said, right, I know what I'm going to do. Instead of waiting for anyone to come to me, I want to get out there and make a big, bold, comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats of a coalition rather than a minority government. At times like this, people want a lead. So I rang John Major, I rang Michael Howard, I rang others and said this was my instinct, and most of them were pretty encouraging. I remember ringing David Davis, who said he thought it was a bad idea, and at that moment I thought probably it was a good idea, actually.
The Shadow Foreign Secretary William Hague and frontbench colleagues joined senior Liberal Democrats for 6.5 hours of intensive discussions.
We were contemplating the first coalition since the Second World War. It's not normal in Britain to form a coalition. We had campaigned all our lives saying these people should not be admitted to government, and we were now discussing how we were going to admit them.
There was a hardcore of people who were always opposed to this alien coalition, that we should have somehow been a minority government, and if we were defeated, go to another election. I'm not sure that that was ever an option that was available.
Hi there. There were definitely those who didn't want us to go into coalition. But I understood people's misgivings, and I think it's true to say that some of the subsequent problems I faced were because people felt I was too eager for coalition, that it sort of was what I wanted, it suited me. I didn't want it because it suited me. I wanted it because I thought it was the right thing for the country.
Mr. Clegg, are you off to meet with Mr. Cameron by any chance? Oddly enough, before we formed the coalition government, I remember how little we talked about Europe. Are you confident of taking your party with you? I think he said jokingly at one point, well, of course, the one thing I don't want to do is bang on about Europe. That's what I've said. And I said, let's please ensure that the one thing that doesn't engulf our coalition government is Europe. All the best laid plans can go awry, as that one clearly did.
Looking at the history of coalitions over the centuries, it never works out well for the junior party. But in the end, we agreed a coalition program. So finally I go home at the end of the negotiations, and I'm looking so exhausted, I'm getting straight into bed, and my wife said to me, "Well, what have you done?" And I said, "I think I might have destroyed the Liberal Party." And then I fell asleep.
David Cameron arrives as Prime Minister with his wife, Sam, to the black door that he must have dreamed of standing in front of.
But I remember, the bank of cameras, the flashes are so bright that you're almost blinded. And they're also desperately worried about not tripping up on the step or falling over or screwing up. That's one of the main things you're worried about. And I think I just, turned to Samantha and said, right, we're going in, it's going to be fine. You're very focused on what you've got to do next, but you're also thinking to yourself, I must try and remember what this moment feels like. Pretty strange is the answer.
And so begin the Cameron years. 5 days after the election, with the haggling finally over, David Cameron's already learnt that power is never easy.
And here they come, looking as if it was the most normal thing in the world, and you still have to almost pinch yourself that this is actually happening.
I didn't fight the 2010 election wanting to fall short and having to have a coalition. I wanted a Conservative-only government, but I was determined to make it work. You might only get one chance at this, and I thought I've got to give it my best. I'm delighted to be standing here with the new Deputy Prime Minister on what I think is a remarkable and very welcome day. Our Liberal Conservative government. A very effective question from one of the journalists was just to remind us of the things we'd said about each other.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
We're all going to have. I'm afraid I did once. And I sort of looked down. Nick Clegg started walking off from his lectern. We're all... Come back! None of that was rehearsed. But there was a bit of me that thought, I can understand some Conservatives will be watching that and thinking, he's enjoying this too much. And it was a bit of theatre, but it got things off to a start where it was, in a way, a bit of leadership that the people in my team could see I was really going to try and make this work. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you very much.
Well, that joint news conference in the garden of Number 10 was something of a love-in. Of course, the big question with any relationship is, will it last?
How did it go this morning, gentlemen?
David Cameron almost slightly inveigled his parliamentary party into a coalition.
Mr. Govin's table, how did it go?
Very well, thank you. It meant that there was this army of Conservative MPs right from the outset who resented the coalition, resented David Cameron, resented George Osborne, resented the Liberal Democrats in it, resented the fact that the programme of government was not a Conservative programme of government, it was a coalition.
Not one party's ideas, but a joint programme for government based on shared ambition and shared goals.
The coalition government inevitably created tensions. There was always a degree of suspicion that the Conservative Party was underrepresented in the decision-making processes. It had at its centre the so-called Quad, comprised of 2 Conservatives and 2 Liberal Democrats, and nothing could become policy for the coalition government without the Liberal Democrats' say-so.
Budget day and all the usual ritual. But it's not just another budget. Just look at those grim faces.
Chancellor, how much is it going to hurt?
The answer is it's going to hurt a lot. No wonder no one was smiling.
It wasn't clear that the coalition would last. This was a brand new experiment, if you like, in British politics, and the expectation was that it would fall apart in months. And so I felt an enormous responsibility to put together a solid economic programme and get it done as quickly as possible to try and build that confidence out there in the world.
Jobs lost, pay cut, benefits squeezed, a budget of pain to pay down the deficit.
People still to this day accuse you of imposing austerity cuts which had a very negative effect on the poorer in society. What's your answer to these constant criticisms that come up again and again?
The criticism is that, austerity was somehow a political choice and that it wasn't necessary. I think that accusation is total nonsense. Britain had forecast as the biggest budget deficit for any country anywhere in the world, not just the Western world, but the whole world. And if you didn't deal with that deficit, it was a clear and present danger to the British economy.
This budget is needed to deal with our country's debts. This budget is needed to give confidence to our economy. This is the unavoidable budget.
Flanked by his Lib Dem allies, the Chancellor set out spending cuts and tax rises worth £40 billion.
The Lib Dems leaders have sacrificed everything they ever stood for to ride in ministerial cars and to ride on the coattails of the Tory government.
It's ironic that although David Cameron's whole pitch was about reaching out to people on middle and low incomes, that in government, David Cameron and George Osborne constantly made the case around the cabinet table to protect and actually to favour those on the highest incomes.
I completely reject that. We protected pensioners, we protected the National Health Service, we protected help to the poorest. And in the end, yes, there were difficult and painful decisions, but actually inequality fell. The share of income tax paid by the richest went up, not down.
Move to one side, please. Politically, it's a risky business. Playing such a central role in this programme of cuts could destroy the Liberal Democrats as a party. Move to one side, please.
We had an immediate task, which was a short-term task, which was to find the savings, the £6 billion, I think it was, in that year in order to get the savings underway. And tuition fees, I believed, was a classic example where you could have a huge reform that would also save you money.
Student demonstration against increased tuition fees ended in violence and destruction. 50 people were arrested and 14 injured when demonstrators broke into the headquarters of the Conservative Party.
We always knew that raising tuition fees would be very controversial. But I think it was an absolutely essential reform, but it was a huge political move at the time. It was very controversial. There were big demonstrations, and of course, for our coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats, it was possibly close to disastrous.
Shame on you! Shame on you for turning red!
Student anger has mostly been directed at the Lib Dems, accused of breaking a pre-election pledge to vote against a rise in tuition fees.
We had the votes in the House of Commons to do it without the Liberal Democrats' support. We'd actually written into the coalition agreement that they could abstain on this crucial issue. And enormously to Nick Clegg's credit in some respects, he wanted to go ahead with these reforms because he thought they were the right thing to do. But I thought it's political suicide for him. And we were in a meeting, just me and him and Danny Alexander and David Cameron in the cabinet room.
George suddenly said, don't do it. And I thought, my God, what's he doing? What's this? And he said,
look, if you want my honest advice, Nick, I'd love your support as Chancellor trying to push these reforms through. But if I were in your shoes, I would not do this. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for you because you made a promise to the public and you will look like you've broken that promise. And he said, I respect that, George. Thank you for telling me, but we're in.
You know, I've heard George Osborne claim this. I've asked other people who were in the room. If he said it, he mumbled it, and I certainly didn't hear it. And I think that is pure Osborne mischief. If we hadn't made the savings in higher education, we would have had to take them, I don't know, from further education or other areas, which would have been far more unfair to more disadvantaged folk in Britain. We clearly paid a heavy political price. And to suggest somehow there was some easy way to escape the noose is both glib and untrue.
Well, in many ways, I thought Nick Clegg was brave to support the tuition fees, but he broke a very distinct and clear promise in doing so. And I think in an age where politicians are, frankly, not that trusted anyway, to go back directly on something that you have said that only you can undo, I think is the worst sort of broken promise.
Libya's leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, has vowed to crush the popular uprising, threatening a house-to-house search for protesters before they're put to death.
Libya came out of the blue. It was David Cameron's first war. He'd inherited Afghanistan, didn't like it politically. He saw that Libya could be his moment in the sun.
Rebels in the eastern Libyan city of Benghazi say they're coming under sustained attack.
I believed that what Gaddafi was trying to do was, nothing short of a potential massacre. And there are always a million reasons for not doing anything. Have we checked with the lawyers? What's the consequences if this goes wrong? Prime ministers should never short-circuit that decision-making and take unnecessary risks, but you sometimes need to bring everyone together, hear all the arguments, but then make the decision. And often they're waiting on you to make that decision because it won't happen without that prime ministerial thump on the table.
The Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir David Richards, and the Defence Secretary Liam Fox were among senior figures at a meeting of COBRA, the government's crisis committee.
In Libya, we were trying to learn the lessons of Iraq, which is that, if you put huge numbers of troops on the ground, that creates problems of its own. And of course, in Libya, the Libyans themselves did not want foreign troops on the ground. But not acting would have been a choice, and I thought it was the wrong choice.
I think David Cameron was absolutely confusing a sense of moral outrage and a moral purpose with what was necessarily in our greater selfish national interest.
I can tell the House that Britain will deploy tornadoes and typhoons, as well as air-to-air refuelling and surveillance aircraft. Preparations to deploy these aircraft have already started, and in the coming hours they will move to air bases from where they can start to take the necessary action.
His heart was 100% in the right place, but my overriding observation is here is a almost uniquely capable leader that came to power a little early and before he developed the wisdom and experience to be a great statesman. And therefore, I used to sort of say to him, you'd be a great battalion commander, but I'm not certain that you're yet ready to command a corps.
And I think with David Richards, who I have great admiration for, I liked working with him. He was a swashbuckling character, and I hired him with my eyes open, knowing that there'd be a bit of swash and buckle, and I might get a bit of it on the way through. But I think it's important that they feel the challenge of a Prime Minister who says, why are we doing this and why not that, and have you considered this possibility? And the military don't always like that. They'd rather be left just to get on with it, but I don't think that's the right approach.
The Libyan leader's compound has been smashed to pieces by bombing. This is the moment millions of Libyans have been waiting for through 6 months of bitter fighting. But with his compound now in rebel hands, there is still no sign of Colonel Gaddafi himself.
I think it's fair to say that it sort of dawned on me, rather than it being explicitly stated after proper debate, that we had de facto changed to a regime change operation.
Colonel Gaddafi said he would hunt you down like rats, but you showed the courage of lions, and we salute your courage.
It was the Libyans on the ground who brought about regime change. Of course, by the military intervention against Gaddafi and his forces, we made that possible for them.
Already you could see that the sort of tribal cohesion was very fragile and it wasn't going to last. And shortly afterwards, Gaddafi was sort of butchered by a mob.
It went from protecting people in Benghazi from the onslaught of Colonel Gaddafi. And it logically followed that if you were going to stop that from happening, you had to stop Gaddafi. And I think that's something that David Richards and others accepted. And I think that's right.
There was no follow-through. We didn't do in Libya after that what we should have done in terms of nation building. The same failure that happened in Iraq on a very grand scale happened in Libya.
We gave an opportunity for a new political settlement in Libya, but tragically, as we find years later, it is taking a very long time for that to bed in. But I still think Libya is better off without Gaddafi, at least has a chance of a stronger and more stable and more democratic future.
Remember that a lot of people were always out to get him. Part of your job as Parliamentary Private Secretary is to be that official in the Roman Empire, always behind the emperor on the triumphal march through Rome, saying, "Remember, O Caesar, you're mortal." My job is to remind him that actually they hate you.
There is already a growing feeling that the Prime Minister's inner circle is out of touch with ordinary members.
It follows reports in several newspapers claiming a senior Tory figure described local association members as mad, swivel-eyed loons.
Swivel-eyed loons? Wasn't Cameron's expression. But that summed up the attitude of that set towards anybody who disagreed with them. We were swivel-eyed loons.
They look harmless enough, but these Conservative activists came to David Cameron's front door to deliver a damning verdict on his leadership. It's the issue of gay marriage that's incensed them. This letter accuses the Prime Minister and his inner circle of treating ordinary party members with contempt.
I won't put it so strongly as to say they despised those people. I don't think they did. But they discounted them, didn't care what they thought. He thought that people who opposed him were bigots, possibly, certainly small-minded, and really, just not of the modern century. They'd been left behind somewhere. Poor things.
Morning, David. Never fought for the Conservatives again because of your views on same-sex marriage, which weren't in your
I want to try. Can I try? I think on the whole issue of gay equality and equal rights, I was something of a slow learner. But I was determined not to just be the hardcore Conservative Prime Minister delivering the tough bit of the package and leaving the social reforms to the reforming Liberal Democrats. I wanted to make sure that, as Prime Minister, I was the modern, compassionate Conservative and continue to make arguments about things like this.
I was virtually the only person in the Whip's office who was actually in support of the measure, or one of the very few. But it was a difficult time because we got huge volumes of correspondence. I remember sitting watching, some of the other whips in the office, answering piles of letters that high about this outrage. It was costing us membership.
I don't think anybody was saying, oh, this is disgusting or anything like that. We believe that once you redefined marriage once, then, as the Archbishop of Canterbury said, why shouldn't you redefine it again? If it no longer means one man and one woman, well, why shouldn't it mean one man and two women, or whatever it might be?
But I fear that the playing field is not being levelled. And there are plenty in the aggressive homosexual community who see this as but a stepping stone to something even further.
Of course, it's a conscience issue. But, on reflection, I wish I'd gone further and piled into the Whip's office and said, look, you're not whipping people, you're not telling people what to do, but this, you're going to be proud when you vote for this. You'll look back and say that was the right decision.
The ayes to the right, 400. The noes to the left, 175.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Following the Commons vote, Britain is now in the vanguard of equality. But David Cameron's desire to modernise the country has split his party.
more Tory MPs voted against the bill than for it.
People often forget today that it couldn't have got through were it not for the fact that Lib Dem MPs and many Labour MPs, of course, supported it. And he said once privately to Nick Clegg, you know, equal marriage is my tuition fees, and I sometimes wish we hadn't done it, and I sometimes think it's been more painful for me than tuition fees was for your party.
The rebellion over it in the party in the country was huge. And there obviously were, you know, it worried me. I was worried I might lose support on other important issues. I never thought it was right to turn back. I kept going, but it was difficult.
I am now very happy to announce that you are now legally husband.
Just after midnight, they were pronounced husband and husband, although the squeals of delight drowned out the words.
His backbenchers had a sort of odd collection of prejudices. They didn't like wind farms. They didn't believe in climate change, some of them. They hated Europe, and they hated equal marriage. And by inflaming Tory backbenchers on the issue of equal marriage, even though the country was actually largely supportive, of course, the effect of that was that David Cameron then ended up having to sort of give them even more red meat on things like Europe.
Legislating for equal marriage is one of the things I'm proudest of as Prime Minister. And there was a wonderful moment actually in number 10 Downing Street itself where the guy who opened that big black door said, Prime Minister, I don't often, you know, talk about politics, or even though I do this job, but I just want to say that because of what you did, I'm going to be able to marry the person I've loved for 20 years this weekend. And that was a sort of spine-tingly moment, because you realised that this was legislation and laws and all the rest of it, but it was making a real difference to people who wanted to show that commitment. And that was I got into the car with an extra spring in my step that day.
See that? That's your referendum for me.
And how were you going to vote?
I'm voting yes.
Why?
Why? Because I want independence.
Difficult issues in politics, if you try and brush them under the carpet, they tend to come up and surprise you. And that wasn't David's leadership style. He believed in having a national debate about the big issues and wanted the country to resolve their issues and, in a sense, put them to bed. And Scotland was one of them.
The Prime Minister knew that obstructive Westminster tactics would only risk building further support for the SNP.
To govern is to choose, as someone said. And I faced a difficult choice, which was there is this Scottish nationalist majority parliament in Edinburgh who wanted a referendum. The choice is deny the referendum, kick the can down the road, put off the decision. That's fine in the short term, but in the longer term, you're building up a stronger case for independence.
It was a risk because, you know, you leave the choice open. But I, as the senior Scot in the cabinet, I believed absolutely if we as the UK government didn't find a way to resolve this question, then the nationalists in Edinburgh would have tried to take the matter into their own hands, and that would have been constitutionally far, far worse and would have led us to a real crisis.
In the rest of the United Kingdom,
David Cameron wasn't initially persuaded that a referendum was the right thing to do, but he came to hold that view, and I think it was a brave thing to do, but it was also the only choice that was really available.
It was the most important referendum because the idea of Scotland leaving our family of nations would have broken my heart. Look, the decision about the European Union, I very much regret we lost the referendum. I wish we'd voted to stay in a reformed European Union, but that was a choice for the United Kingdom to make. The breakup of the United Kingdom, to me, was, you know, would have been far worse. I think people can feel it's a bit like a general election, that you make a decision and 5 years later you can make another decision. If you're fed up with the effing Tories, give them a kick and then maybe we'll think again. This is totally different to a general election. This is a decision about not the next 5 years, it's a decision about the next century.
I'm Labour. Up here with your red coats. Yeah, okay. Up here with your red coats and your 30 pieces of silver.
I'll give you 30 pieces of silver if you just shut up.
All the way through the No campaign, keeping the United Kingdom together was ahead, and then the polls started to narrow before the end. And then when I was in Scotland staying at Balmoral, this Sunday Times poll came out putting independence, separation ahead for the first time, and it hit me like a blow to the solar plexus. I just remember the sort of awkwardness as this newspaper everyone was sort of looking at without picking up, and the slight clinking of cutlery and glasses and embarrassed looks around the table and mounting sense of panic that I had that this could go the wrong way. I remember conversations I had with my private secretary and he had with the Queen's private secretary and I had with the Queen's private secretary, not asking for anything that would be in any way improper or unconstitutional, but just a raising of the eyebrow, even, you know, a quarter of an inch, we thought, you know, make a difference.
It's not so much an intervention, I think, more an observation. Apparently somebody had joked with her that, well, we mustn't talk about the referendum, to which the Queen, perhaps a little surprisingly, chose to say simply this: well, I hope people will think very carefully about the future.
It was certainly well covered, and although the words were very limited, I think it helped to put a slightly different perception on things.
The last few days of the referendum were very fraught and anxious, and David was really concerned. I can remember on the evening of the referendum sitting in Downing Street, watching the TV with him. I think it was probably the most nervous I've ever seen him before any election or referendum that he was involved in.
I don't know why I bothered even trying to go to sleep on the night of the vote. I was completely exhausted. I think I slept for about half an hour, or tossed and turned in my bed for half an hour, went downstairs, and there was an extraordinary scene because there were camp beds everywhere, the press office was full with people, the results were starting to come through, and it was all looking like it was going right.
No, 19,000.
No, 37,153.
62,700.
The next 2 hours were blissfully happy ones. There I was with my children on my knee, surrounded by my team and all these people who've been working so hard, and result after result was coming through and they were all going the right way.
No, 139,788.
This is the moment when the referendum result was confirmed. 140,000 voters in Fife would take the no support across the finish line.
There was a wonderful feeling of relief. Of course, there was some personal relief, but the biggest relief was the United Kingdom was staying together. We'd won.
David Cameron believed that he could always sort of punch his way out of difficult corners. You know, he'd become Tory leader against all odds. He'd managed to be Prime Minister in 2010 against the odds. He won the Scottish referendum campaign. He began to believe that he was undefeatable in elections, that he could always win, that he could make pledges and then sort out the problems later. And Nick Clegg said one day he will be caught out and this strategy won't work. And sadly for the country, he was right.
Now, we Liberal Democrats, we've put the country first over the last 5 years. We've shown that coalition government can work.
People say about me that I was very comfortable running a coalition government. I was. I enjoyed the challenge of bringing these parties together and delivering, but there were also frustrations and things we couldn't go further and faster on.
Look, I've done coalition. We made it work. We've got a good record. I've got the T-shirt, but I don't want to do that again.
We knew we had to win seats in order to win an overall majority. And my team said, look, the truth is, if you want to win a majority, here are the seats you've got to win, and a lot of them are Liberal Democrat seats. Now, I know that's awkward because they're your coalition partners, but they said don't be in any doubt. They are trying to win all of your seats. They're trying to kill you in all of your constituencies, and we knew that. We could see the Liberal leaflets going out, the Liberal campaigns, get rid of the wicked Tories and all the rest of it. Politics is a brutal business. Taking a risk, having a punt, having a go, that pumps me up.
You live by the sword, you die by the sword in politics. There's no point whinging. It's a rough game. But it was just yet another example of the Conservative Party doing anything they needed to do, however unscrupulous, to secure their short-term survival, but constantly forgetting to think about what happens next.
The Conservatives have defied all the pundits and won a majority of MPs in Parliament.
The seats that has got David Cameron from the 307 he had last time to the 331 he's got now are essentially the seats of his Liberal Democrat junior coalition partners.
But I think this is the sweetest victory of all. The fact that every election we always think we're going to displace those Lib Dems in the West Country, and we've finally done it. The 2010 to 2015 government was a difficult time. We had to take very difficult decisions over the economy, but at the end of the day, the plan had worked. The deficit was down by 2/3. Good reforms have been put in place on education and on welfare and elsewhere. You know, I think we won that election because we said we'd had a plan, we stuck to the plan, we delivered on it, and it had been an effective government.
Clearly, the results have been immeasurably more crushing and unkind than I could ever have feared. For that, of course, I must take responsibility, and therefore I announce that I will be resigning as leader of the Liberal Democrats. It was a pretty raw, emotional, time for me. And then to sort of put salt into the wounds, I had to stand to attention next to David Cameron in front of the world's media. It was like being in the stocks, really. So when we went back into the Foreign Office after the cenotaph, David Cameron came in, and I think he was possibly embarrassed. He just didn't look me in the eye. I thought, I'm about to go, I've got to say something. So I remember saying to him, I said, look, David, we built a good and stable and moderate government together. Don't screw it up. Famous last words.
After winning an election victory, I felt a Prime Minister and a leader liberated in many ways, and obviously it's a great personal regret for me that we weren't able to carry through so many of those exciting plans. We had a majority, I had lots of energy, I had a great team, and I think of all the things that we could have done and should have done if we'd been able to hold that referendum, win it, and move on to the rest of the domestic and international agenda. So a whole agenda, a whole lot of work that we could have done effectively ran into the sands of the European issue.